In small mountain towns, everyone knows everyone. You recognize your neighbors by the sound of their footsteps. You know which cabins keep their lights on past midnight. You remember which families moved in last month and which have been there for generations. In a place like that, secrets are almost impossible to keep. But sometimes the worst secrets hide in plain sight. Sometimes the person who commits unspeakable evil lives 2 doors down, waves hello in the morning and sleeps peacefully, while the rest of the town lies awake wondering who did this. On the morning of April 12, 1981, in a tiny resort community called Keddie, nestled in the Sierra Nevada mountains of Northern California, a 14-year-old girl came home from a sleepover to find her mother, her brother, and his friend brutally murdered in their living room. Beaten, stabbed, strangled, bound with tape, victims of a savage attack that defied comprehension. Her 12-year-old sister was gone, missing, vanished without a trace. And sleeping in the next room, somehow unharmed through hours of violence so brutal it left blood on the walls and ceiling, were 3 boys, including one whose stepfather lived just 2 cabins away. This is the story of the Keddie cabin murders, the quadruple homicide that destroyed a family and devastated a community. The investigation so badly bungled that evidence was lost, leads ignored, and suspects protected. And the case that remains officially unsolved 44 years later, though many believe they know exactly who did it, and why no one has ever been held accountable. Imagine driving through the Sierra Nevada mountains in Northern California. Spring 1981. You're on Highway 70, winding through forests of pine and cedar, past streams swollen with snowmelt, climbing higher into the mountains where the air smells like wood smoke and damp earth. You pass through tiny towns with populations in the hundreds, places that exist because of logging or tourism, or simply because people have always lived there. Towns where a traffic jam means 3 cars waiting at the only stoplight. Where the general store sells everything from groceries to fishing tackle. Where children ride bikes on empty roads and nobody locks their doors. About 60 miles northwest of Reno, Nevada, you reach Keddie. Barely even a town, really. More like a collection of buildings scattered along the highway, a post office, a small restaurant, a gas station, and nestled among the pine trees, a cluster of rustic cabins that used to be a vacation resort, but now serve as low-income housing for families who can't afford anywhere else. Keddie Resort. 33 small cabins, weathered wood and peaked roofs, numbered and arranged along quiet dirt roads. Cabin 1 through cabin 33. Most are occupied by families trying to make ends meet. Single mothers, retirees on fixed incomes, people working minimum wage jobs in nearby Quincy. It's the kind of place where children play together regardless of which cabin they live in. Where neighbors borrow cups of sugar and watch each other's kids. Where you know the sound of your neighbor's car pulling up at night. Where murder doesn't happen until it does. Prologue: The Sharp Family. In July 1979, Glenna Susan Sue Sharp packed everything her family owned into a car and drove away from Connecticut. She was 34 years old, a mother of 5, fleeing a marriage that had become unbearable. Her husband, James Sharp, was abusive, emotionally, physically, in every way that mattered. For years, Sue had endured it for the sake of her children, but finally, she'd had enough. Her brother Don lived in California, in a town called Quincy in the Sierra Nevada foothills. He offered to help, said she could stay with him, get on her feet, start over. So Sue loaded up her kids, John, 13, Sheila, 12, Tina, 10, Ricky, 8, and Greg, 3, and made the cross-country drive to Northern California. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to build a life without fear. When they arrived in Quincy, Don let them stay in a small trailer he owned at the Claremont Trailer Village. It was cramped, 1 bedroom for 6 people, but it was theirs. Sue enrolled the kids in school. She took a typing class to improve her skills. She got a part-time job as a bartender at the Quincy Elks Lodge, working nights and weekends. The kids adjusted to their new life. John, the oldest, got a job bagging groceries. Sheila and Tina made friends. The younger boys, Ricky and Greg, were too young to fully understand why they'd left Connecticut, but they seemed happy enough. By late 1980, Sue had saved enough money to move the family out of the cramped trailer. She found a place in Keddie, cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort. Keddie Resort had seen better days. Built in the 1920s when the railroad brought tourists to the Sierra Nevada, the resort had thrived for decades. Families would come for summer vacations, fishing, hiking, escaping the heat of California's Central Valley. The cabins were quaint and rustic, each with a living room, small kitchen, and a few bedrooms. But by the 1970s, tourism had declined. The cabins fell into disrepair. The resort owners couldn't make money anymore, so they converted the property into low-income rental housing. Most of the cabins were occupied year-round now by families who paid $170 a month for a place to live. Cabin 28 was one of the larger units, 4 rooms plus a small living room and kitchen, much bigger than the trailer, and the rent was affordable. Sue moved her family in during November 1980. The cabin wasn't fancy. The wood paneling was dark and dated. The carpet was worn. The kitchen appliances were old, but it had space. John got his own small bedroom in a converted back area. Sheila and Tina shared a room. The 2 younger boys, Ricky and Greg, shared another. Sue slept on the couch in the living room most nights. The family settled in quickly. The kids made friends with other children at the resort. John, now 15, was popular, tall, good-looking, friendly. He worked at the local market and had a girlfriend. Sheila, 14, was responsible and mature, often helping her mother with the younger kids. Tina, 12, was sweet and outgoing. Ricky, 10, and Greg, 5, were typical boys full of energy, always playing outside. Sue continued working at the Elks Lodge and taking classes. She was determined to build a better life for her family. She wanted to get a better job, maybe become a secretary or office worker. She dreamed of eventually affording a real house, not just a rental cabin. By April 1981, Things seemed to be looking up for the Sharp family. They had no idea they had less than 6 months to live. Cabin 26, just 2 cabins down from the Sharps, was occupied by the Smart family. Marilyn Smart was in her late 20s, a mother of 2 from a previous marriage. Her son, Justin, 12, often played with the Sharp boys. Marilyn worked part-time and took care of the household. Her husband, Marty Smart, was in his late 30s, a cook at the Keddie resort who'd taken the job after bouncing around various locations. Marty had a temper. Neighbors knew this. So did Marilyn. Their marriage was troubled. Arguments, accusations, tension that everyone could hear through the thin cabin walls. Marty and Marilyn had become friendly with Sue Sharp. They'd met in a typing class at the local community center. Sue, herself a survivor of domestic abuse, had confided in Marilyn, and Marilyn had confided back, telling Sue that Marty was physically abusive, that she wanted to leave him, but didn't know how. Sue encouraged her, told her she deserved better, offered to help if Marilyn decided to leave. Marty found out about these conversations, and he was furious. In early 1981, a man named John Beau Boubed moved into cabin 26 with the Smarts. Beau was in his 40s, a hulking man with a criminal record. He claimed to be a former Chicago police officer and a Vietnam veteran, though no records would ever confirm either claim. He had an intimidating presence and allegedly had connections to organized crime back in Chicago. Beau had become friends, or something like friends, with Marty Smart. The two drank together, spent time at the local bar, talked about women and grievances and whatever men like that talk about. Beau had met Sue Sharp. He'd even asked her out, according to some accounts. She'd rejected him twice. Neighbors would later remember seeing Marty and Beau together constantly in the weeks before the murders. They'd remember hearing arguments between Marty and Marilyn. They'd remember tension in the air, though no one could have predicted what was coming. April 11th, 1981. The day, Saturday, April 11th, 1981, started like any normal day in Keddie. Sue Sharp was home with her kids. The weather was pleasant, spring in the Sierra Nevada, with wildflowers blooming and the last of the winter snow melting in the high country. Around midday, Sue's eldest son John and his friend Dana Wingate decided to hitchhike to Quincy, about 6 miles away. Hitchhiking was common in 1981, especially in rural areas. Kids did it all the time. John and Dana wanted to hang out in town, maybe see friends, kill time on a Saturday afternoon. Sue drove them part way and dropped them off. The boys hitchhiked the rest of the way to Quincy. Back at cabin 28, Sue's daughter Sheila made plans to spend the night at the neighbor's house, cabin 27, occupied by the Seabolt family. Sheila was friends with the Seabolt kids and often slept over. Around 8 p.m., Sheila left for the Seabolts, carrying her overnight bag. Tina, the 12-year-old, went over to the Seabolts as well to watch TV with the family, but around 9:30 p.m. she asked what time it was and then said she needed to go home. She walked back to cabin 28, just a few steps away, and went inside. John and Dana returned from Quincy sometime after 10 p.m., having hitchhiked back. They came home to cabin 28. The exact time isn't known. Witness accounts vary between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. Sue was home. So were Tina, John, and Dana. And staying over for the night was another boy, Justin Smart, Marilyn's 12-year-old son from cabin 26. Justin often spent the night with Ricky and Greg Sharp, his friends. The three younger boys, Justin, Ricky, 10, and Greg, 5, went to sleep in one of the back bedrooms. Sue, John, Tina, and Dana were in the living room and kitchen area. And sometime after 10 p.m., someone came to cabin 28. Someone with a hammer and a knife and rage. Part 1. The Discovery. April 12th, 1981. Morning. Sheila Sharp woke up around 7 a.m. at the Seabolt's house in cabin 27. It was Sunday morning. The Seabolt family was getting ready for church. Sheila decided she wanted to go home and change clothes before going with them. Around 7:45 a.m., she walked the short distance back to cabin 28. The front door was unlocked. That wasn't unusual. People in Keddie rarely locked their doors. Sheila opened the door and stepped inside. What she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. The living room was destroyed, furniture overturned, blood everywhere, on the floor, splattered on the walls, dripped on the ceiling. The smell was overwhelming, copper and death and something worse. And there were bodies. Her mother, Sue, lay on the floor near the couch, partially covered with a blanket. She was bound with electrical cord and medical tape, naked from the waist down. Her face was so damaged Sheila almost didn't recognize her. Her brother John, 15, lay nearby, also bound. His throat had been cut. His head was battered beyond recognition. John's friend Dana Wingate, 17, was on the floor as well, bound and beaten, his face destroyed by repeated blows. Sheila screamed. She ran, out the door, back to cabin 27, screaming for help. Jamie Seabolt, the oldest son of the Seabolt family, ran back to cabin 28 with Sheila. He looked inside, saw the carnage, and immediately thought of the younger boys, Ricky, Greg, and Justin. They'd been in the cabin. Where were they? Someone, possibly Jamie, possibly Sheila, remembered that the boys had been sleeping in a back bedroom, if they were still in there. They went around to the side of the cabin, to the window of the bedroom where the boys had been sleeping. The window was accessible from outside. Jamie called out, knocked on the window. 3 faces appeared, Ricky Sharp, Greg Sharp, and Justin Smart, alive, unharmed, confused about why someone was at their window. "Come out through the window," Jamie told them. "Don't go into the living room, just come out." The 3 boys climbed out the window. They hadn't seen the bodies. They hadn't seen what happened in the living room. They said they'd slept through the night, hadn't heard anything unusual, just woke up and wondered why it was so quiet. Meanwhile, someone from the Seabolt cabin ran to the Keddie Resort Lodge, and told Jan Albin, the co-owner, that something terrible had happened at cabin 28. At 8:05 a.m., Jan Albin called the Plumas County Sheriff's Office. "I think there's been a murder at the Keddie resort," she said. Deputy Hank Clement was the first officer to arrive. He approached cabin 28 cautiously. The front door was still open. He stepped inside. The scene was worse than anything he'd encountered in his career. Plumas County was a quiet, rural area. Deputies dealt with drunk driving, domestic disputes, petty theft. Not this, never this. 3 bodies, blood everywhere, signs of extreme violence, beaten, stabbed, strangled. The victims were bound with electrical cord and what appeared to be medical tape, white with a blue pattern. Deputy Clement immediately called for backup and secured the scene. By midday, the cabin was swarming with law enforcement. Plumas County Sheriff Doug Thomas arrived to take charge of the investigation. Detectives from the California Department of Justice in Sacramento were called in because the small rural sheriff's department had no homicide investigation unit, no forensic team, no experience with something like this. Forensic specialists would eventually arrive from Reno, Nevada, but the delay meant hours passed before proper evidence collection could begin. Hours during which the scene was contaminated by multiple people walking through, touching things, moving items. The coroner and forensic team documented the victims' injuries. Glenna Sue Sharp, 36 years old, multiple stab wounds to the chest and neck, blunt force trauma to the head, struck with the butt of a BB rifle found at the scene, bound with electrical cord and medical tape, defensive wounds on her hands. She'd fought back. Partially nude, though no evidence of sexual assault. Appeared to have been attacked first, as she had the most defensive injuries. John Sharp, 15 years old, throat slashed. Multiple blunt force trauma injuries to the head from a hammer. Bound with electrical cord. Manually strangled. His hands showed some defensive wounds. He'd tried to fight. Dana Wingate, 17 years old, massive blunt force trauma to the head from repeated hammer blows, manually strangled, bound with electrical cord and medical tape. Fewer defensive wounds. He may have been taken by surprise or overwhelmed quickly. The violence was extreme, personal. The kind of attack driven by rage, not by a calculated need to kill. Forensic experts estimated the attacks had occurred sometime between midnight and 2 a.m., based on body temperature, rigor mortis, and other factors. As investigators documented the scene, they realized something crucial. There should have been one more person in the cabin. Tina Sharp, the 12-year-old daughter, was missing. Her siblings confirmed she'd been home. She'd come back from the Seabolts around 9:30 p.m. She should have been in the cabin. But she wasn't there. Not alive, not dead, just gone. Was she hiding somewhere? Had she escaped during the attack? Or had whoever killed her mother and brother taken her? Investigators searched the resort grounds, the surrounding woods, the nearby creek. No sign of Tina. A missing child turned this from a triple homicide into a potential abduction. The The FBI was notified, search parties were organized, Tina's photograph was distributed. But privately, investigators feared the worst. If Tina had witnessed the murders, the killers wouldn't have let her live. They must have taken her body somewhere else. The question was, why? Why take one body but leave 3 others? 2 weapons were found at the scene. A claw hammer covered in blood and hair. The wooden handle was splintered from the force of the blows. A steak knife from Sue's kitchen, bent at a 30-degree angle from being used with such force. Additionally, a Daisy BB rifle that belonged to the Sharp family had been used to beat Sue. The wooden stock was broken and bloodied, but forensic examination suggested there might have been additional weapons that were removed from the scene. Some injuries didn't match the weapons found, and the medical tape used to bind the victims wasn't from the Sharp cabin. Sue didn't own any tape like that. Whoever did this had come prepared. They'd brought weapons, they'd brought tape. This was planned. One of the most baffling aspects of the case was the survival of the 3 boys, Ricky Sharp, 10, Greg Sharp, 5, and Justin Smart, 12. They'd been asleep in a bedroom that shared a wall with the living room where the murders occurred. The violence had been extreme, screaming, fighting, furniture being overturned, bodies being bludgeoned. And yet the boys claimed they'd heard nothing, slept through it all. How was that possible? Investigators initially believed the boys might have been drugged or knocked unconscious, but medical exams showed no evidence of sedation. Some theorized the killers had deliberately spared them, either because they knew the boys and didn't want to harm children, or because killing them wasn't part of the plan. Others suspected the boys knew more than they were saying, that they'd seen or heard something but were too terrified to admit it. Justin Smart, in particular, would give conflicting statements over the years. Sometimes he said he'd seen nothing. Other times he described seeing shadowy figures in the cabin. Once he mentioned seeing Sue Sharp covered in blood with 2 men standing over her. But he was 12 years old, traumatized, and his stepfather lived 2 cabins away. If Justin had seen something that night, seen who did it, would he have felt safe telling the police? Part 2. The investigation begins. As forensic teams processed Cabin 28 throughout April 12th and 13, they documented a scene of extraordinary violence. Blood was everywhere, on the floors, walls, ceiling. Spatter patterns suggested the victims had been beaten while standing, then beaten more while on the ground. The fight had moved around the room, from the couch area to the kitchen and back. Furniture was overturned, a coffee table was broken, lamps were knocked over, the telephone cord had been ripped from the wall, suggesting someone had tried to call for help and been stopped. Significantly, there was no sign of forced entry. The front door showed no damage, the windows were intact. Whoever came to Cabin 28 that night had been let in or had come in through an unlocked door without resistance. This suggested the killers were known to the victims, or at least not perceived as a threat when they first arrived. In the living room, investigators found a bloody butcher knife on the couch. It was bent. Testing would show it was from Sue's kitchen and had been used in the attack. The hammer found at the scene was a standard claw hammer, available at any hardware store, no distinguishing marks, covered in blood, hair, and tissue from multiple victims. And there was the medical tape, white with a blue pattern, wrapped around the victims' mouths and binding their hands. Sue didn't own tape like this. The killer had brought it. From the beginning, the investigation was plagued by mistakes and oversights that would haunt the case for decades. Before forensic specialists arrived from Reno, multiple people walked through cabin 28. Deputies, the coroner, neighbors, even some reporters. Evidence was disturbed. Items were moved. The scene was not properly secured for the first several hours. Contaminated scene. Before forensic specialists arrived from Reno, multiple people walked through cabin 28. Deputies, the coroner, neighbors, even some reporters. Evidence was disturbed. Items were moved. The scene was not properly secured for the first several hours. Missing evidence. Photos and evidence were lost or misplaced. A cardboard box containing crucial evidence, including the hammer, was reportedly stored in a storage shed and then went missing. It wouldn't be found again until 2016. Poor documentation. The crime scene was not photographed comprehensively. Many angles and details were never documented. Later, when investigators wanted to review the scene, they had to rely on incomplete photos and memories. No fingerprint results. While fingerprints were lifted from the scene, there was confusion about whether they were properly processed. Some prints were never compared to suspects. Others were lost. Decades later, investigators wouldn't even be sure what prints had been collected. Overlooked witnesses. Several neighbors reported hearing screams or seeing suspicious activity that night, but their statements were not thoroughly documented or followed up on. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department was small and inexperienced with major crimes. They were overwhelmed, and crucial mistakes in the first 48 hours would make solving the case exponentially harder. The autopsies conducted by Dr. Anthony Kozelka provided grim details. All three victims had died from a combination of injuries: blunt force trauma, stab wounds, and manual strangulation. The overkill was notable. Each victim had been struck far more times than necessary to cause death. Sue had approximately 30 stab wounds and multiple blunt force injuries. John's skull was fractured from repeated blows. Time of death was estimated between midnight and 2 a.m. on April 12th. Sue showed the most defensive wounds, suggesting she'd fought the longest. John and Dana also had defensive injuries, but fewer. They'd been quickly overwhelmed. Toxicology showed no drugs or alcohol in significant amounts in any victim. Most significantly, the medical examiner noted that the pattern of injuries suggested at least 2 attackers, possibly 3. The violence was too widespread, the victims too numerous, for a single person to have controlled and killed all 3 in the confined space without some escaping or fighting back more effectively. Detectives interviewed residents of the Keddie resort, trying to establish who was home that night, who saw or heard anything unusual. Several accounts stood out. The Seabolt family, cabin 27. Sheila Sharp had been sleeping over. The family had heard nothing unusual during the night. They went to bed around 10:30 p.m. and didn't wake until morning. Cabin 26, the Smarts. Marilyn Smart said she'd been home with her son Justin, who'd slept at the Sharps' cabin. Her husband Marty and his friend Beau Boubed had gone out that evening, she said. They came home late. She wasn't sure exactly when. After 1 a.m., maybe 2 a.m. When asked if Marty or Beau had blood on their clothes or seemed agitated, Marilyn said no. They seemed normal. Went to bed, woke up the next morning and heard about the murders like everyone else. Other neighbors, several people reported hearing screams around midnight or shortly after. One neighbor, Sheila's teacher, lived across the road and said she heard what sounded like a woman screaming, "Help me," multiple times around midnight. But she'd assumed it was just an argument or drunk people and hadn't called police. Another neighbor reported seeing lights on at cabin 28 late into the night, later than usual. And one witness, whose statement wouldn't be properly documented for years, reported seeing a green van parked near cabin 28 in the early morning hours of April 12th. The van was unfamiliar, not a vehicle belonging to any Keddie resident. On April 15th, 3 days after the murders, the Butte County Sheriff's Office, a neighboring county, received an anonymous phone call from a man who claimed to have information about the Keddie murders. The caller said he'd been hitchhiking near Keddie on the night of April 11th. Around 11:30 p.m., he was picked up by two men in a brown Dodge. The men seemed nervous, agitated. They had what looked like dried blood on their clothes. During the ride, one of the men mentioned something about a job they'd done in Keddie, about taking care of someone. The hitchhiker said he'd felt threatened and gotten out of the car as soon as possible. He provided descriptions of the two men, but no names. Butte County passed the information to Plumas County Sheriff's Department. Whether it was ever seriously investigated remains unclear. The anonymous caller was never identified or interviewed further. Was this a legitimate tip, or someone seeking attention, or perhaps someone trying to point investigators away from the real killers? Within days of the murders, investigators had identified several persons of interest. Marty Smart, the neighbor from cabin 26. Investigators noted his proximity to the scene, his troubled marriage, and reports that he'd been angry with Sue Sharp for encouraging his wife to leave him. But Marty had an alibi. His wife said he'd been out but came home in the early morning hours, and there was no physical evidence linking him to the scene. John Beau Boubed, Marty's friend and roommate. Beau had a criminal record and a reputation for violence, but like Marty, he had the alibi provided by Marilyn Smart, and investigators found no evidence connecting him to the murders. James Sharp, Sue's estranged husband back in Connecticut. Had he hired someone to kill her, or come to California himself? Investigators contacted Connecticut authorities. James Sharp's whereabouts on April 11th, 12 were verified. He'd been in Connecticut, not involved. Various transients. Keddie was near Highway 70, and hitchhikers and drifters passed through regularly. Could the murders have been committed by strangers? It seemed unlikely, given the personal nature of the violence and the fact that nothing was stolen. But investigators couldn't rule it out. The ex-boyfriend theory. Some reports suggested Sue had been dating someone before the murders, and that relationship had ended badly. Investigators looked into this but found no substantial evidence. The problem was that while there were persons of interest, there was no solid evidence against anyone. No murder weapon with identifiable prints, no witnesses who'd seen anyone enter or leave cabin 28, no confessions. And every day that passed, the trail grew colder. Part 3. Tina. The search for 12-year-old Tina Sharp consumed enormous resources in the days and weeks after the murders. Hundreds of volunteers combed the forests around Keddie. Search dogs tracked through the woods and along the banks of the Feather River. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew overhead. The National Guard was called in to help search remote areas. Every abandoned building, every cave, every ravine was checked. Divers searched the river and nearby lakes. Tina's photograph was distributed nationwide. The FBI entered her into their database of missing children. Age-progressed images were created showing what she might look like as she got older. But weeks passed, then months. No sign of Tina Sharp. Her siblings lived with the terrible uncertainty. Was she alive, held captive somewhere? Or had she been killed and her body hidden so well no one would ever find it? Sue Sharp's funeral was held without Tina. The grief was compounded by not knowing. John, Sue, and Dana were buried, but Tina remained in limbo, missing, not confirmed dead, but almost certainly gone. On April 22, 1984, 3 years and 11 days after the murders, 2 bottles hunters were searching for recyclable cans in a remote area near Camp 18, about 60 miles from Keddie. They were walking through a wooded area off a logging road when one of them noticed something white among the underbrush. It was a human skull. They called the police immediately. When investigators arrived and carefully searched the area, they found partial skeletal remains scattered over a small area, the remains of a child based on size and bone development. Dental records confirmed the identity: Tina Sharp. She'd been found about 100 miles from where she'd been taken, in a remote, heavily forested area near Feather Falls in Butte County. The area was so isolated that it's unlikely anyone would have stumbled upon it except by chance. Because Tina's remains had been exposed to the elements for 3 years, the forensic evidence was limited. The skeleton was incomplete. Animals and weather had scattered the bones. Soft tissue was gone. The skull showed damage consistent with blunt force trauma. She'd been struck in the head, likely killed with similar weapons used on the others. But the big question was, when had she been killed? Had she been taken from cabin 28 alive and held captive for days, weeks, or months before being murdered? Or had she been killed that same night and her body driven to this remote location immediately? The forensic pathologist couldn't say for certain. The condition of the remains didn't allow for precise time of death determination beyond at least several months before discovery. But investigators theorized she'd been killed the same night as the others, probably before dawn on April 12th. The killers had taken her body, possibly to prevent her from identifying them if she'd survived initially, or perhaps because moving her body was easier than leaving it at the scene. Then they'd driven her to this remote location and dumped her, knowing it might be years before she was found. But why take Tina? The question that haunted investigators. Why take Tina's body but leave the others? Several theories emerged. Theory 1. She wasn't dead yet. Perhaps Tina had been injured but not killed in the initial attack. The killers took her to finish her off elsewhere, away from potential witnesses. Theory 2. Witness protection. If Tina had witnessed the killers' faces and they knew her, they needed to take her body to a different location to create distance between themselves and the crime. Theory 3. Sexual assault. Some investigators theorized Tina had been sexually assaulted, though this could not be confirmed from skeletal remains, and her body was taken to hide evidence of that crime. Theory 4. She was a specific target. Perhaps the entire attack was motivated by a desire to kidnap or harm Tina specifically, and the others were killed because they were witnesses. Theory 5. Confusion in darkness. Maybe the killers thought they'd killed everyone and didn't realize until later that they'd grabbed Tina instead of leaving her. Or maybe they panicked when they realized she was alive and took her. None of these theories could be proven, but the fact that Tina's body was moved suggested the killers had transportation and knowledge of the area. This wasn't random. It was someone local, someone who knew the back roads in remote locations. Camp 18, near where Tina was found, was a logging camp area in Butte County. Investigators looked into who had access to that area in 1981, logging operations, people who worked in the forest, hunters who knew the territory. And they discovered something interesting. Bo Bubed had previously worked in logging operations and would have been familiar with remote forest roads in the area. This didn't prove anything. Plenty of people in Northern California knew logging roads, but it was another data point connecting Bo to the crime. Part 4. Suspects. As the investigation progressed through 1981 and 1982, detectives increasingly focused on two men, Martin Smart and John Bo Bubed. The circumstantial evidence was compelling. Proximity. They lived in cabin 26, just 2 cabins from cabin 28. They could have walked there in seconds. Motive. Marty Smart was reportedly angry with Sue Sharp for encouraging his wife Marilyn to leave him. Some witnesses said Marty had made threats saying Sue was interfering in his marriage. Opportunity. Both men claimed to have been out the night of the murders and returned home in the early hours. No independent verification of their whereabouts. Behavior. In the weeks after the murders, neighbors reported that Marty seemed anxious, drinking heavily and acting paranoid. Bo reportedly left Keddie shortly after the murders. The knife. One witness later claimed that Bo Bubed had a knife that matched the description of one possibly used in the murders, though this was never confirmed. Justin's presence. Marty's stepson Justin had been sleeping in the Sharp cabin that night. Why? Some theorized the killers had deliberately sent Justin there so he'd be out of cabin 26 during whatever they were planning. But that raised the question, why not wait for a night when Justin wasn't at the Sharps' cabin? Investigators tried to build a case against Smart and Bubed. They obtained warrants to search cabin 26. They collected items for testing, clothing, knives, tools, but the searchers turned up nothing definitive. No bloody clothes, though 3 weeks had passed, plenty of time to destroy evidence. No murder weapons, no physical evidence linking either man to the scene. The medical tape used to bind the victims was a potential lead. It was distinctive, white with a blue pattern. Detectives tried to trace where it came from. They discovered it was medical tape used in hospitals and clinics. Marilyn Smart worked at a medical clinic. Could she have brought tape home? Could Marty have taken it from her work supplies? But they never found matching tape in cabin 26 or definitively linked the Smarts to that specific type of tape. In the months after the murders, Marty Smart's life fell apart. His wife Marilyn finally left him, taking Justin and moving away from Keddie. She'd filed for divorce, and in court documents she'd describe years of physical and emotional abuse. Marty spiraled. He drank heavily. He bounced between jobs. He became increasingly paranoid, telling people he thought someone was following him, that they were going to blame him for something he didn't do. In September 1981, 5 months after the murders, Marty Smart moved away from Keddie. He relocated to different parts of California, never staying anywhere long. He would occasionally call the Plumas County Sheriff's Department, according to some reports, demanding to know if he was still a suspect. He'd insist he had nothing to do with the murders, that he was being unfairly targeted. Bo Bubed left Keddie even sooner than Marty, within weeks of the murders. He moved back to Chicago, where he'd originally come from. Investigators tried to track him, but Bo was skilled at disappearing. His criminal background had taught him how to avoid attention. Over the years, California investigators would periodically try to locate Bo for questioning, but he was always one step ahead, moving to new addresses using different names, keeping a low profile. In 1988, 7 years after the murders, Bo Bubed died in Chicago. The cause of death was listed as complications from diabetes and other health issues. He was in his early 50s. He died without ever being charged, without ever confessing, without ever being definitively ruled in or out as a suspect. In 1984, 3 years after the murders, an interesting piece of evidence emerged. A man living in Keddie, not a suspect, just a resident, was cleaning out an old storage area when he found a jacket that didn't belong to him. It was a men's work jacket, and it had what appeared to be bloodstains on it. He turned it over to police, explaining he had no idea where it came from or how long it had been in his storage area. Testing showed the stains were indeed blood, but DNA analysis was still rudimentary in 1984. The blood type was determined to be consistent with one of the victims, but that wasn't enough for definitive identification. The jacket was sent off for more testing and then disappeared. It was never seen again. Whether it was lost, destroyed, or simply misplaced in evidence storage, no one could say. Decades later, when DNA analysis had advanced enough to potentially identify the jacket's owner or confirm victim DNA, the jacket was nowhere to be found. It was yet another frustrating dead end in a case full of them. Part 5. The Cold Case. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the Keddie cabin murders case grew cold. Detectives who'd worked on it retired. Files were boxed up and stored. New sheriffs took over Plumas County, and the case became less of a priority as years passed with no new leads. The surviving Sharp children, Sheila, Ricky, and Greg, tried to rebuild their lives. They were raised by relatives, scattered to different parts of California. They rarely spoke publicly about the murders, wanting to move forward rather than constantly revisit trauma. But they never forgot. They wanted answers. They wanted justice for their mother, brother, and sister. In 1987, a Plumas County grand jury reviewed the Keddie case, looking at all available evidence and testimony. They concluded that there was not sufficient evidence to indict anyone. The case remained officially unsolved. Over the years, various theories circulated. Some believed it was Smart and Boobed acting together in a rage-fueled attack. Others thought it might have been a drug-related killing, though there was no evidence the Sharps were involved in drugs. Some theorized it was a sex crime that went wrong. A few believed it was connected to organized crime or motorcycle gangs that operated in the area. But without physical evidence or confession, it was all speculation. In the 2000s, true crime media was exploding. Cold cases were being reopened with new forensic technology. DNA analysis had advanced dramatically. Computer databases could now cross-reference evidence in ways impossible in 1981. The Keddie cabin murders case caught the attention of investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths. It had all the elements of a compelling mystery: brutal violence, missing evidence, suspicious suspects who'd never been charged, and a grieving family still seeking answers. In 2008, Sheila Sharp, now an adult in her 40s, began speaking publicly about the case. She wanted renewed attention. She wanted investigators to take another look with modern technology. She also revealed something she'd never publicly discussed. She believed she knew who killed her family. She believed it was Martin Smart and Bo Bubeid, and she believed the Plumas County Sheriff's Department had failed to properly investigate them because of incompetence, corruption, or both. In 2013, Plumas County Sheriff Greg Hagwood assigned investigator Mike Gamberg to take a fresh look at the Keddie case. Gamberg had actually lived in Keddie as a young man in 1981. He'd known the Sharp family. He'd watched the investigation unfold and had always felt it was botched. Now, as a seasoned investigator, he had a chance to revisit it with modern tools and fresh eyes. Gamberg dove into the old case files, hundreds of pages of reports, interviews, evidence logs. What he found shocked him. The investigation had been far worse than he'd realized. Crucial evidence had been lost or destroyed. Witnesses had never been properly interviewed. Clear leads had been ignored. The crime scene had been contaminated. Evidence collection had been haphazard. And then, in March 2016, Gamberg made a stunning discovery. While sorting through old evidence stored in a cabin that had been used for storage, Gamberg found a box. Inside were items that should have been processed decades ago. The hammer used in the murders, never properly analyzed for DNA, kitchen knives from the scene, pieces of the medical tape used to bind victims, clothing items, other physical evidence. The box had been sitting in storage for 35 years, apparently overlooked or deliberately hidden. Why? Had someone wanted this evidence to disappear? Or was it simply incompetence, evidence logged and then forgotten? Gamberg immediately sent the items for modern DNA analysis. And then he made an even more shocking discovery. In April 2016, while going through old case files, Gamberg found a letter. It was dated 1984, 3 years after the murders. It had been sent anonymously to the Plumas County Sheriff's Department, but had apparently never been properly investigated. The letter was from someone claiming to be Marilyn Smart, Marty Smart's ex-wife. In the letter, the writer said that Marty had confessed to being involved in the murders. She described how Marty had come home on the night of April 11th, 1981, with blood on his clothes, how he'd been paranoid and drinking, how he'd eventually, in a drunken rage months later, admitted that he and Beau had taken care of Sue Sharp. The letter writer said she was terrified of Marty and couldn't come forward publicly, but she wanted police to know the truth. The letter had been filed away and apparently never thoroughly investigated. No one had tried to verify if Marilyn Smart had actually written it. No follow-up questions had been asked. Gamberg tracked down Marilyn Smart, now living under a different name in a different state. When confronted with the letter, Marilyn was shocked. She said she hadn't written it, but the information in it was accurate. Someone who knew details about her life with Marty had written it. Who and why anonymously? Marilyn told Gamberg that yes, Marty had made statements over the years that suggested he was involved. He'd been violent and paranoid. He'd said things like, "They can't prove anything, and I know how to get away with it." But she'd been too afraid to come forward. Marty was dangerous. She'd fled the marriage and tried to forget about Keddie entirely. Now, decades later, she was willing to cooperate with the investigation. Through interviews with Marilyn and others, Gamberg pieced together statements Marty Smart had made over the years. In the mid-1980s, while drunk, Marty had allegedly told a friend, "I killed that Sharp woman because she was encouraging my wife to leave me. Bo helped." In the 1990s, according to another acquaintance, Marty had said, "There are things I've done that I can never take back." In 2000, shortly before his death, Marty had allegedly told a therapist or counselor about being involved in a violent incident years ago in Northern California, though he hadn't provided details. None of these were formal confessions. None were recorded. They were all hearsay, statements reportedly made to others, remembered years later, impossible to verify, but they painted a picture of a man carrying tremendous guilt. Martin Smart died in 2000 at age 66. The official cause was unknown, according to some records. He'd been living in relative obscurity, having moved around California for years. By the time he died, he was estranged from most of his family. He died without ever being charged with the Keddie murders. When the newly discovered evidence was tested using modern DNA analysis in 2016 to 2018, the results were both revealing and frustrating. DNA matching Martin Smart was found on a piece of medical tape recovered from one of the victims, not on the outside but on the tape's adhesive side, suggesting his DNA had somehow been transferred to the tape, possibly from handling it before it was used in the crime. Other DNA evidence was too degraded to produce clear results. Remember, this evidence had been sitting in poor storage conditions for 35 years. Much of it was contaminated or deteriorated. But the presence of Smart's DNA on the binding tape was significant. How did it get there if he wasn't involved? The defense would argue, if there'd been a trial, contamination, transfer, coincidence. But combined with everything else, the proximity, the motive, the suspicious behavior, the alleged confessions, it was compelling circumstantial evidence. Part 6. The Truth. What investigators believe happened. Based on decades of investigation and the evidence gathered, here's what modern investigators believe occurred on the night of April 11th and 12, 1981. Martin Smart had been growing increasingly angry with Sue Sharp. His wife Marilyn had been talking about leaving him, and Marty blamed Sue for encouraging her. In his mind, Sue was destroying his marriage. Bobo Bed may have had his own grudge. Sue had rejected his advances, and men like Bo don't handle rejection well. The two men had been drinking together that evening, talking about Sue, working themselves up into a rage. Maybe it started as just talk. Someone should teach her a lesson, but it escalated. They decided to confront Sue, maybe just scare her, maybe rough her up a bit, teach her to stop interfering. They sent Justin Smart to sleep over at the Sharp cabin, getting him out of cabin 26, ensuring he wouldn't be there when they came home later. Around midnight or shortly after, Smart and Bubed went to cabin 28. They knocked, or perhaps walked in through the unlocked door. Sue was still awake in the living room with John and Dana. Tina may have already gone to bed in one of the back rooms. The confrontation started as words, heated, aggressive, but it escalated quickly. Perhaps Sue fought back verbally, refusing to be intimidated. Perhaps John and Dana stood up to defend her. Perhaps someone threw a punch. And then the violence exploded. Smart and Bubaid had brought weapons, the hammer, possibly additional knives. They'd brought the medical tape. Whether they'd planned murder from the beginning or it spiraled out of control, we'll never know. But once it started, they couldn't stop. Sue fought, John fought, Dana fought, but against two grown men with weapons in a small confined space, they didn't stand a chance. The attack was brutal, prolonged. The rage was personal. This wasn't a quick execution, it was a frenzy. When it was over, 3 people were dead. The living room was destroyed, and Smart and Bubaid realized they had a problem. At some point, either during the attack or immediately after, they discovered Tina. Maybe she'd been hiding. Maybe she'd witnessed part of it. Maybe they found her in a back bedroom and realized she was a witness. They couldn't leave her alive, but for some reason, perhaps she was still breathing, perhaps they panicked about killing a child in the cabin. They took her. They carried her out to their vehicle, the green van some witnesses reported, and drove her to the remote location near Camp 18, a place Bo knew from his logging days. There they killed her, probably with blows to the head, similar to the others. They left her body in the woods and drove back to Keddie, arriving home in the early morning hours. They cleaned themselves up, disposed of bloody clothes, got rid of the vehicle they'd used, which might explain why a green van was reported. It wasn't their usual vehicle. They assumed the crime would be treated as a random attack, maybe blamed on transients or drifters. They had an alibi, each other and Marilyn, who'd say they were home. And if Justin remembered anything, he'd be too scared to say. He was 12 years old. His stepfather was one of the killers. What could he do? The investigation was bungled from the start. Evidence was lost. Leads weren't followed. The crime scene was contaminated. But more than that, there may have been deliberate interference. Some investigators believe there were individuals in Plumas County law enforcement or local government who protected Smart and Bubaid, either because of personal connections or corruption, or simply incompetence they didn't want exposed. The anonymous letter from 1984 was ignored. Clear evidence was lost. Suspects weren't properly investigated. By the time serious investigative attention returned to the case in the 2000s, Bubaid was dead and Smart was dying. Too late for prosecution. As of 2025, the Keddie cabin murders remain officially unsolved. No one has ever been arrested or charged with the murders of Sue Sharp, John Sharp, Dana Wingate, or Tina Sharp. Martin Smart and Bo Bubaid are deceased and cannot be prosecuted. However, in multiple public statements since 2016, Plumas County Sheriff Greg Hagwood has said that investigators believe they know who committed the murders, and that if the suspects were still alive, there would be sufficient evidence to obtain arrest warrants. He has not officially named Smart and Bubede, but every indication points to them as the primary suspects. The case remains open because no one has been formally charged. Some evidence remains unprocessed or unanalyzed. There may be living accomplices or witnesses who haven't come forward. The families deserve official closure. Even if we accept that Smart and Bubed were the killers, questions remain. Why did Justin survive? Was it deliberate, sending him to sleep at the Sharps to get out of the way, then carefully avoiding the back bedroom where he slept? Or coincidence? Was anyone else involved? Some investigators believe there may have been a third person, perhaps as someone who helped dispose of Tina's body or helped cover up the crime. Who wrote the anonymous letter in 1984? If it wasn't Marilyn, who knew enough details to write it? A family member, a friend Marty confessed to? What happened to the missing evidence? Was it deliberately hidden, or just incompetently stored? Why was the investigation sabotaged? If there was deliberate interference, who was responsible, and why protect these men? Epilogue: The cost of failure. The three surviving Sharp children, Sheila, Ricky, and Greg, have lived their entire adult lives in the shadow of April 12, 1981. Sheila Sharp, who discovered the bodies at age 14, has spoken publicly about the lasting trauma. She's described nightmares, PTSD, survivor's guilt. For years she blamed herself, wondering if there was something she could have done, some way she could have prevented it if she'd been home that night instead of sleeping at the neighbors. She's also expressed anger and frustration at the investigation. She believes her family was failed by law enforcement, that incompetence and possibly corruption allowed her family's killers to escape justice. Ricky Sharp, who was 10 years old and sleeping in the cabin during the murders, has largely stayed out of the public eye. The trauma of that night, sleeping through his mother and brother's murders, waking to chaos, has affected him profoundly. Greg Sharp, only 5 years old in 1981, has few direct memories of that night, but grew up knowing his mother and siblings were brutally murdered and no one was punished for it. Justin Smart, Marty's stepson who survived the night at the Sharp cabin, has given conflicting accounts over the years. Some investigators believe he knows more than he said, that he may have seen or heard something but was too frightened to speak, especially if his stepfather was involved. Justin has struggled with substance abuse and legal troubles over the years, behaviors consistent with severe childhood trauma. Dana Wingate's family has also sought answers for decades. Dana was just 17, spending the night at his friend's house. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. His family has maintained that he was a hero, that he fought to protect Sue and John, that he died trying to defend them. Keddie was never the same after April 12, 1981. The resort, already declining, became infamous. People didn't want to live there anymore. Families moved away. The cabin stood increasingly empty. By the early 1990s, most of the Keddie resort cabins were vacant. In 2004, Cabin 28, The murder cabin was demolished. The owners couldn't rent it, couldn't sell it, so they tore it down, hoping to erase the memory. But you can't demolish history. The site where Cabin 28 stood remains empty, a patch of bare ground among the trees, unmarked except in the memories of those who know what happened there. The other cabins gradually fell into disrepair or were demolished. By 2010, the Keddie resort, as it had existed in 1981, was essentially gone, just a few scattered structures and overgrown lots. The town of Keddie itself remains tiny, a post office, a few businesses, fewer than 200 residents. It's a place people drive through, not to, and everyone who lives there knows about the murders. The Keddie cabin murders case stands as a textbook example of how not to investigate a homicide. Contaminated crime scene. The scene was not properly secured. Multiple people walked through before forensic processing. Evidence was moved and disturbed. Lost evidence, crucial physical evidence, the murder weapons, binding tape, clothing, was improperly stored and lost for decades. The bloody jacket disappeared entirely. Poor documentation. The crime scene wasn't thoroughly photographed. Witness statements were incomplete. Evidence logs were sloppy. Ignored leads. Anonymous tips were filed away. Witness statements about suspicious vehicles and people weren't followed up. Clear suspects weren't properly investigated. No chain of custody. Evidence handling was so poor that even when items were found decades later, defense attorneys could argue they'd been contaminated or planted. Possible corruption. Whether through incompetence or deliberate interference, the investigation failed at every level. The case became required reading in some forensic investigation courses, as an example of what happens when basic procedures aren't followed. But the lessons came too late for Sue, John, Dana, and Tina Sharp. In 2004, when Cabin 28 was demolished, members of the Sharp family held a small memorial service at the site. They planted flowers. They said prayers. They remembered Sue, John, and Tina not as murder victims, but as the people they'd been. A mother who'd fought to protect her children. A teenage boy who'd been popular and kind. A little girl who'd loved to laugh. There is no official memorial plaque in Keddie. The town wanted to move on, to forget. But the family remembers. And so do the people who followed this case for decades. True crime researchers, investigators, journalists, and ordinary people who believe that justice delayed is justice denied, but that the truth still matters even when legal accountability is impossible. As of 2024, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office maintains that the Keddie cabin murders case remains open and active. In 2021, Sheriff Hagwood announced that additional evidence had been sent for advanced DNA testing using techniques that didn't exist even in 2016. He expressed hope that these tests might provide conclusive proof of the killer's identities, even though both primary suspects are deceased. The goal isn't prosecution anymore. That's impossible with Smart and Bubede dead. The goal is official resolution. The families deserve to have the case formally solved. The victims deserve to have their killers officially named. And if there were accomplices or people who helped cover up the crime, they could potentially still be charged with accessory after the fact or obstruction of justice. In 2022, Sheila Sharp released a book about the case, co-written with journalist Richard Bohr. In it, she details her family's story, the investigation's failures, and her belief that she knows who killed her family. The book includes reproductions of investigative documents, photographs, though not graphic crime scene images, and interviews with people involved in the case. It's her attempt to ensure that what happened to her family isn't forgotten and that the failures of the investigation are documented. In late 2023, investigators announced they were pursuing new leads based on witness testimony from people who were children in 1981 but are now adults willing to speak. One person came forward claiming to have seen something the night of the murders, a vehicle or people acting suspiciously, but had been too young at the time to understand its significance. Another person reported that a relative now deceased had made statements years ago suggesting knowledge of the crime. These leads are being investigated, though skeptics point out that memories from 40+ years ago are notoriously unreliable, especially when filtered through decades of media coverage and public speculation. Still, investigators say they're committed to pursuing every possible avenue until the case is definitively resolved. If Martin Smart and Bo Boubed did kill the Sharp family, and all evidence suggests they did, the question that haunts everyone is, why weren't they arrested in 1981 or 1982 when the trail was fresh? The evidence was there even then. Proximity and opportunity, motive, suspicious behavior after the murders, witness statements about arguments and threats, physical evidence, the medical tape, though not definitively traced. Justin Smart's presence in the cabin that night. Why didn't investigators push harder? Why didn't they bring Smart and Boubed in for serious interrogation? Why didn't they obtain search warrants immediately? Several theories have been proposed. Incompetence. The Plumas County Sheriff's Department was small, rural, inexperienced with major crimes. They simply didn't know how to handle a case of this magnitude. Corruption. Some believe local officials protected Smart and/or Boubed for personal or political reasons. Perhaps Smart had connections. Perhaps someone owed him a favor. Perhaps evidence was deliberately lost to protect him. Fear. Boubed's alleged criminal connections and reputation for violence may have intimidated investigators or witnesses. People might have been afraid to speak up. Benefit of the doubt. In 1981, the idea that your neighbor, someone you knew, could commit such horrific violence was harder for people to accept. Investigators may have unconsciously looked for external suspects rather than believing someone local could do this. Legal caution. Without a confession or definitive physical evidence, prosecutors may have been reluctant to charge Smart and Boubed, fearing an acquittal would permanently close the case under double jeopardy rules. Whatever the reason, the failure to act quickly quickly meant that by the time DNA technology could have definitively solved the case, both suspects were dead. The Keddie cabin murders case is often cited in discussions about the importance of competent criminal investigation. It's a reminder that justice isn't automatic. It requires properly trained investigators, adequate resources, careful evidence collection and preservation, willingness to follow leads wherever they go, courage to investigate powerful or connected suspects, timely action before evidence degrades or witnesses die. When any of these elements are missing, justice fails. And families like the Sharps are left with decades of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. In recent interviews, Sheila Sharp has been clear about what she believes happened and what she wants. "I know who killed my mother and brother," she said. "Everyone who's looked at this case seriously knows. But knowing and proving in court are two different things. What I want now is for the case to be officially closed with the killers named. I want it in the record. I want my mother's name cleared from any suggestion she was involved in something that led to this. I want people to remember that she was murdered protecting her children and that the men who did it were never held accountable. And I want people to understand how badly the investigation was mishandled. Maybe it can't help my family now, but maybe it can prevent the same mistakes from being made in other cases." Ricky Sharp has said, "I was 10 years old, asleep in the same cabin where my mother was being murdered. I've had to live with that my whole life. I deserve to know, officially, not just from rumors and theories, who did it and why." The surviving family members have filed multiple complaints and requests over the years, pushing for renewed investigation, demanding accountability for the botched evidence handling, and seeking official resolution. They've been promised many times that answers are coming, that new evidence will solve the case, that closure is near. 44 years later, they're still waiting. The Keddie cabin murders isn't just a cold case. It's a snapshot of rural America in 1981, a time when domestic violence was often ignored, when small-town law enforcement was sometimes more about maintaining appearances than seeking justice, when people protected their neighbors even when they suspected terrible things. It's a case about poverty. The Sharp family living in a run-down resort cabin because they couldn't afford better, trying to build a new life away from abuse. It's a case about violence against women. Sue Sharp leaving an abusive husband only to be killed, allegedly by another violent man, angry that she'd encouraged his wife to do the same. It's a case about how children are victimized not just by violence, but by systems that fail to protect them. Sheila discovering her family's bodies, Justin sleeping through his mother's murder, Tina taken and killed, Ricky and Greg left to grow up with the trauma. And it's a case about how the powerful and connected can escape justice while the vulnerable and marginalized are forgotten. What we know for certain is that on the night of April 11th, 1981, someone entered cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort in California. They brought weapons, at minimum a hammer and a knife. They brought tape to bind victims. This was planned. They attacked Sue Sharp, 36, her son John, 15, and his friend Dana Wingate, 17. The violence was extreme, personal, driven by rage. All three victims were beaten, stabbed, and strangled. They fought back but were overwhelmed. Sue's daughter Tina, 12, was taken from the scene, either during the attack or immediately after. 3 years later, her remains were found 60 miles away in a remote forest location. 3 boys, Ricky Sharp, 10, Greg Sharp, 5, and Justin Smart, 12, survived the night, sleeping in a back bedroom. They heard nothing, saw nothing, or were too frightened to admit what they'd witnessed. The investigation was catastrophically mishandled. Evidence was lost, ignored, or possibly deliberately hidden. Clear suspects were not properly investigated. Martin Smart and John Bobed, neighbors of the Sharp family, had motive, opportunity, and access. Circumstantial evidence points to their involvement. Alleged confessions were never properly documented or investigated. DNA evidence from 2016 linked Smart to the crime scene. Both men died before they could be charged. The case remains officially unsolved. The case reminds us to take domestic violence seriously. Sue fled one abusive marriage only to be killed, allegedly by someone abusing his own wife. To demand competence from law enforcement, mistakes in the first 48 hours can doom a case forever. To reserve evidence carefully, technology advances, but only if evidence survives to be tested. To listen to children, they may know more than they can articulate, especially under fear. And to never give up seeking truth. The Sharp family has fought for 44 years for answers. Imagine driving through Keddie, California today. You pass the spot where cabin 28 once stood. There's nothing there now, just empty ground reclaimed by grass and trees. No marker, no memorial, just silence. But if you stop and close your eyes, you can almost hear it. A mother's scream, a teenager fighting for his life, a little girl calling out for help that never came. You can feel the weight of injustice, killers who died without being charged, evidence that disappeared, a system that failed so completely that 4 people's lives were snuffed out and no one was held accountable. And you can sense the lingering presence of unanswered questions. Who else knew what happened that night? Who helped cover it up? Who could have spoken up but stayed silent? The Sierra Nevada mountains are beautiful, pine forests and clear streams and air that smells like wilderness. It's the kind of place people go to escape, to start fresh, to find peace. Sue Sharp thought she'd found that in Keddie, a place far from her abusive husband, a place where she could raise her children safely. But unfortunately, she was wrong. Sleep well, if you can.